I would like to thank everyone for being here today, and most importantly, the organizing committee, who, again, this year put a very important and very interesting event to the public that is, of course, of great interest to all of us. All right, so without further ado, I would like to start my talk, and I hope you all can see my slides well. So, trapped by screens, social media, mental health, and the pitfalls of addiction. Okay, so this is what is in store today. I would like to start by defining a couple of things that we're going to be discussing today. So understanding what it is that we mean by social network sites, also known as social media. Some context on usage, some of the motivations behind it. I think it's important for us to understand the psychology behind it. We'll also define it, of course, because it's important that we know exactly and precisely what we mean by social media addiction, so that we don't inaccurately or mistakenly call social media addiction when, in fact, there isn't a problem with that. Of great importance to us as well is considering the impact of social media addiction on human psychology and behaviors as a whole. And for some of you, understanding the assessment issues around it and sort of a treatment options or approaches that we have will be also interesting. All right, so social network sites, also known as social media addiction, includes actually a quite varied and wide range of platforms or services online that people can use. So some of you may not know this, but actually WhatsApp and YouTube are considered social media platforms. People can interact with other people, they can create content or generate content, they can share those contents with other individuals who are interested or not interested and then become interested. And these people will be consuming those contents, whether it's in video form, short video form, or purely text-based or image-based as well, such as Reddit, which also includes text, by the way. But these platforms, despite the many differences they have, they do share quite a few things in common. And that is the fact that they all intend to keep users engaged with these platforms for as long as possible, which leads to prolonged time spent to use those platforms. One thing that is interesting to us here is that, as you probably know, all of these platforms, or most of them, are free. And as the old saying goes, if it's free, then you're the product, and that's really, really true. So just so you know, in 2023, Meta, the parent company of Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, they actually had a revenue of $134 billion US, which is quite astounding. Another smaller company owned by Microsoft, or another smaller social media platform, I should say, LinkedIn, made $15 billion in revenue in US dollar last year. So there are quite big incentives for social media platforms to actually keep users hooked, because that translates to increases to their bottom lines, meaning their finances. Also important to us is to consider to what extent social media use is common in today's world. And as you can see here, perhaps not a big surprise, when we look at the latest statistics, we see that slightly over 60% of the entire world's population is actually actively using social media platforms, so around 5 billion users. China providing the largest user base, followed by India, Europe, and the US. Another thing that is quite interesting to us to understand the context of social media use and also addiction is that typically, on average, people will spend 143 minutes a day using social media. So if you think about it in relative terms to occupation, so that's nearly 17 hours a week, basically almost like having a part-time job, which, as you can see, is a significant thing that people do in their daily lives. A couple of statistics on popular platforms here. I think you all probably know this: Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, WhatsApp being one of the most popular ones. In Europe, the trends are quite interesting as well, very similar to the world statistics. Basically, nearly 60% of all individuals in the EU actually use social media in 2023. Some variations there according to different countries. So this is a report from the European Union I think from the European Union, Eurostat, and they reported the latest figures. So interestingly, for Slovenia, it's slightly above the average of the EU average of 59, so around 63.46%, which is quite interesting. So Slovenia is a high engagement country when it comes to social media use. Just so you know, in these particular reports, the definition of using social media, where they drew all these statistics, relates to when a person creates a user profile, they start posting messages or images, and they do that regardless of the platform. It could be Facebook, X, formerly Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, and so forth. So it basically means using in its full sense, not just having a profile. What is also interesting is that the more engaged people are with social media, then the more accounts they have. So probably a lot of you have WhatsApp, might also watch YouTube videos. So there you have 2 accounts already. And that number escalates really, really rapidly if you look at different parts of the globe. So number of accounts per person could range from 11 in India to 3.8 in Japan. Gender use is quite balanced as well, I would say, or relatively balanced. So depends on the statistics you look at. There might be slightly more male than females, but typically they're quite balanced. And those gender variation will be more noticeable in different types of social media platforms. So if you think about TikTok, mostly there's way more females than males. Other social media platforms like Twitter, for example, with more males than females. So there will be platform-specific variations as well. So the next question that we might have, we need to ask is, why is social media so enticing? Why are people actually spending nearly the amount of time you would do in a part-time job? Well, the reason for that is that there are big incentives for social media platforms to keep people hooked, and they do use a lot of different tricks in the design, in the user experience of these platforms that make them a lot more enticing to the user, a lot more attention grabbing, I should say. Some examples of these different design features they can implement include things like infinite scrolling. I don't know if you noticed that, but when you're scrolling Facebook, Twitter, for example, it never really ends. You can never really go to the bottom. And that encourages using excessively and continuously as well. One of the things about all of these features is that what they're doing here is that they take the best, or leverage the best of our understanding of human psychology and behavior to create those addictive interfaces and features. A lot of the things that also make social media platforms really, really captivating is the fact that you can almost have immediate social feedback on what you do, like button, thumbs up, double blue tick, icon when someone read your message. So these things keep users in the loop, okay? And another thing is the so-called algorithm. So having your own tailored, personalized news feed is also something that users typically appreciate, and one thing that makes them even more interested in using social media platforms because it's more personal to them. Just to finalize here, well, obviously the issues around gamification. So social media platforms are even more commonly using game strategies to make the platforms more interesting and interactive, and they gamify it. So there is incentives for people to continue to use these platforms. Cool. So another thing that we psychologists are interested in understanding before discussing social media addiction is this very question. So why are people using social media beyond these different design features? So what are the psychological motives? And here actually you will see that different papers, different studies will pick up different motives or psychological motivations and motivational factors that people typically tend to show as the reason why they use social media addiction. So that could range from more socially based motivational factors, so to know what's going on with other people in their lives, so personal contact, keeping those social relationships is also really important, or maintaining them. Entertaining, really, really powerful reason as to why people use social media. Sometimes it's just nice to watch those cat videos when you're bored or after work. I'm personally guilty of that. Some people may also use specific social media platforms to meet new people as well, especially if you think about dating apps. So that's primarily where people would do that. And a couple of really important reasons, socially based, these are the main factors, I would argue, that make people drawn to using social media. And one thing that is interesting to us here is that social media platforms, similarly to other technologies, can also help people regulate their mood. Okay, whether this is a useful and always healthy coping strategy, it's up for debate, of course. But in fact, when you're watching those positive or entertaining videos or reading those interesting stories that you like, this typically tends to not only decrease loneliness, but also increase your well-being as well. Obviously, these motives will differ according to age and gender. There's no really a real consensus on what exactly the psychological motivational factors are, but these are really good ones that we can think of. Okay, so before we dive into the world of social media addiction, and now that we have a little bit of understanding of the context associated with it, the next question is it all really that bad? Is it all doom and gloom? One thing that we must say here, or I must say, is that when used appropriately and in a moderate way, judiciously, I would say, social media use is actually okay and beneficial for most users. Okay, and actually, a lot of people will get positive benefits from using social media, including things like boosts to their well-being, as I have just mentioned. That will improve and strengthen the quality of social relationships and friendships as well. It keeps those that are apart together, which is very powerful to a person's well-being. There has been some studies looking at clinical samples, especially those with autism, for example, conditions such as autism, and how social media use can actually increase their subjective well-being through happiness. And also, if you think about the powerful social rewards people get from social media, when you post a story about something that you've done that is interesting to you, and other people actually corroborate or agree with your point of view, or actually like what you've been doing or what you've been posting, that really tends to boost your self-esteem as well. So for most people, these are the sort of positive outcomes they may get. So improved well-being, self-esteem, and so that there's a lot of positives there as well. But what is also important to us is that, there is a high number of social media users in the world, as we have just seen, roughly slightly over 60% of the whole global population. And if we were to be very conservative about the real prevalence of excessive and addictive use of social media users in the world, we would still have a fairly high number of users that are potentially experiencing problems due to excessive use and addiction. So because of that, a couple of studies have been conducted recently, especially over the past decade or so, where they have been discussing this issue of social media addiction quite intensively, actually. But one thing that is important is that, yes, that's true that these studies suggest that there is a link between spending large amounts of time using social media and experiencing the sort of negative outcomes that follow that. So poor mental health, lower self-esteem, well-being as well. That tends to happen to a minority of users, but it is still a problem that happens to these people, okay? Another thing, or another caveat I should say, is that it's not just because someone is spending relatively high number of time or minutes or hours using social media every day that this usage necessarily reflects addiction. So it's not the same as addiction. Spending a relatively high amount of time is not necessarily addiction. It might be a sign, but for us to infer addiction, we need to look into what is called the functional impairment and the clinical distress, meaning when a person uses social media for 10 hours, is that disrupting their lives? Are they able to fulfill their commitments? Are they able to keep their relationships healthy and working well? Are they still able to be productive at work or academically productive if they're students? So if the answer to all of that is yes, they're working well, then the time they spend using social media might not necessarily be a problem related to addiction. But if they spend that amount of time and then that time disrupts everything else, then we can consider the case of addictive use. And that's really, really important for us, especially those of you doing clinical work, is that beyond looking at the symptoms of social media addiction, it is important to do that holistic assessment and really understand the context of social media use and to what extent it might be disrupting a person's life. That's often a lot more informative than just looking at the symptoms and the severity. So with that said, as you can imagine, the world of social media addiction and the field of social media addiction has been plagued by a lot of issues, especially around terminology. And at the beginning, the whole phenomenon of social media addiction was purely described as Facebook addiction. And the reason for that was because Facebook was and has been for many, many years the most popular platform. But the problem with this terminology is that it is specific to a platform. And when we talk about addiction, we need to be talking about the behavior and the phenomenon as a whole, detached from the platform. Facebook may end next year or may not end at all. But the behavior itself will be here to stay, and people will still potentially be experiencing problems towards other social media platforms. So there has been some work on that to improve the terminology, and it really is important that this work is done, because the terminology then shapes the way people define this problem, and also that also has implications for the way assessment is done, right? So, but in general terms, there is no single perfect fitting definition for social media addiction. But what we know is that from the literature, typically people experiencing social media addiction will show this will be overly preoccupied, will be obsessed in a way with using social media platforms, and they do have this strong motivation to be using social media platforms constantly. They will spend a lot of time doing that, and part of what happens next is that then that excessive commitment and usage of social media then interferes with other things in life, such as academic commitments, professional commitments, interpersonal relationships. But again, more important than the actual symptoms, it's also important to understand that which areas of life are being affected by excessive social media use. And one thing that is also interesting here is that typically when a user is addicted to using social media, they feel like they've lost control over their usage, and they keep using excessively even though they know it's causing them harm. So there is this inability to actually stop and regulate the usage of social media, even though they're clearly suffering from these usage. Okay. So the next question we might want to ask ourselves is related to, okay, if we believe social media is an issue, which, by the way, social media addiction is not currently officially recognized as a mental health disorder. Currently, we only have two behavior addictions that are recognized as two behavior addictions that are recognized as such, meaning gambling, pathological gambling, and video game addiction. Social media addiction is still being considered as a potential issue related to internet use, but at the moment it is something that is mostly academically studied. Okay, so there is no official classification yet, but maybe this will change in the future. And one thing for us to understand whether this is a real issue or not is to have a solid understanding of what we mean by social media addiction, how we define it, and also understand the potential widespread of this problem, so meaning the prevalence rates, right? And there has been quite a few interesting studies conducted in the field more recently, and the figures will vary. So the extent to which different parts of the world, different countries, different populations will be affected by social media addiction will vary according to the area, the geographical area, the country, cultural factors, such as in more individualistic, collectivistic nations. Prevalence rates tend to fluctuate a little bit. And perhaps without a big surprise, the way in which social media addiction is assessed, what kind of psychometric test has been used, what kind of cutoff points have been used, and how people were defined according to these measurements. So what kind of scoring system has been used. So those things tend to change a lot the prevalence rates. But my understanding and my view is that if you do all these things right, if you have a large sample, if you have a representative sample, if we're using a solid psychometric test and you use a strict polythetic, for example, diagnostic approach, actually monothetic would be better here. That typically tends to lead to lower prevalence rates. And I would say that a real prevalence rate would be no more than 5%. But obviously you see that this figure will vary across different nations, okay? Typically Asian nations have much higher prevalence rates on every other addiction, and that is expected, okay? That is also expected. So, social media addiction has actually been found to be both a predictor and an outcome, meaning it results from and leads to a wide range of psychological and psychiatric issues, dysfunctions in terms of emotion regulation, other eating disorders, well-being issues such as low self-esteem, decreased life satisfaction. So there is a wide range of issues that will follow or we will be actually quite well associated with social media addiction. And that's part of the reason why there is a strong case for us to understand and accept this idea that actually social media addiction is a thing, and it actually impairs quite a lot of important areas of a person's life. Okay? So, another thing that we might be interested in understanding is, what are the factors that, or some of the factors I would say, that might actually predict social media addiction? And I've done a study in 2018 with other colleagues on this. So we were trying to look at what are the important factors that we believe might be interesting to predict social media addiction, to help us understand why it occurs. Obviously, this is a cross-sectional study. We cannot definitely say that there is a causality here. And obviously, we also didn't investigate many other important factors, such as, for example, social media motivations. But three key things we're looking here. So FOMO, fear of missing out. So that anxiety that social media platforms are really good at creating, which is that people start missing out, or they believe that they're missing out on experiences that other people will be having that are great, enjoyable, and rewarding that they are not having because now they're not constantly connected. So that kind of anxiety that others are doing cool things and you're not is really, really a big player in explaining excessive social media use and also social media addiction. So social media maladaptive cognitions, we know from a lot of CBT-based models that try to treat and explain addictive disorders, that maladaptive cognitions play a big role as well. So things like people believing in ideas that they're better online, they're more competent online, feeling socially awkward when speaking with people offline as opposed to online, or having false beliefs that they can only get to know a person really well if they do that online as opposed to in person, which might be true for some people, but sometimes that can reflect quite a big cognitive distortion. And obviously, we know that social media addiction can not only cause mental health issues, but also be a symptom of those underlying issues. And in this particular study, we looked at depression, anxiety, and psychosis, so psychiatric distress. And what we saw here is that actually FOMO was one of the biggest predictors here in our study. So this idea that people will end up using more social media because they simply do not want to miss out on what's going on, and that then drives excessive use and potential addiction. Okay. And interestingly, in this study, we only found 4.9% of potentially addicted individuals to social media. But yeah, quite an interesting way for us to understand some of the predictors, bearing in mind that there will be others as well. Okay. So Another thing that is really important for us to also consider is the issue of social media use, social media addiction, and gender. And we might be asking whether females are more likely to be addicted to social media than males. That's a really important question, because then we can understand what sort of risk factors there might be. Okay, so we want to know what kind of factors we can identify that may predispose female users to greater risk or male users to greater risk. Okay, so there are some interesting data suggesting that females actually spend more time on social media than males, and typically are younger when they start doing that. Another thing that is interesting is that females typically often they put more emphasis and value in relationships than males, and social media use is then a tool for them to fuel that behavior and that motivation. I would say it's an evolutionary motivation that drives them to be more invested in these social relationships. Okay? Males will use social media too, to a great deal, but the motivations will vary. Some studies will say that males typically tend to use social media for dating, making new friends, and females for more, to cater for that social needs of connectedness and following, being connected with other people. Excuse me. Another thing that is also interesting is that then, if you start looking at prevalence rates, you will see that these would differ. Sometimes studies will say that females are affected more by social media addiction than males. Sometimes males will be more affected, but I guess it really depends on how this is being measured, what kind of sample you have, and what kind of social media platforms are we looking at. Okay. So one interesting study that actually looked at this is a meta-analysis by Sue and colleagues. So that was conducted in 2020, or published in 2020, and they were looking at studies reporting the prevalence rates and the likelihood of females exhibiting greater levels of social media addiction or rates of social media addiction than males. What they found was that females indeed, when we look at these studies collectively, they show greater rates of social media addiction than males, but as you see here, this G minus 0.2 is not a great and very large effect size, but nevertheless, it is an effect. And you will see that depending on the different parts of the world, you will see these rates changing a little bit. So in Europe and North America, so mostly here in purple, there will be stronger negative effect sizes, which means that there's higher addiction rates in females. In parts of Asia, South America, so India and Colombia as well, the effect sizes tend to be smaller or even positive, which suggests that there's a greater tendency for males to show higher levels of social media addiction than females. So it really is different depending on how you look at it, but as a whole, it seems that females tend to show greater risk to social media addiction than males. So now, if you think about those potentially experiencing social media addiction or those endorsing the symptoms of social media addiction, you might want to know the importance or relevance for male and female on these symptoms. So the question here is, what is the experience for male and females when it comes to these symptoms of social media addiction? So we can look at the kind of the links between the symptoms, but also the most important symptoms or the most central symptoms according to each gender. So I'm going to break it down to you, but basically this study looked at social media addiction using a very popular measure of social media addiction that looks at 6 key symptoms, so salience, so to what extent a person is preoccupied with social media, craving intolerance, so the need to be using social media more and more and more, mood modification, so basically using social media to improve your mood, to feel better about whatever might be bothering you, relapse out of control, so that inability to stop using social media, and even if you do that, then you go back to using it, withdrawal symptoms, so those negative feelings and symptoms of like irritability, a little bit more anxiety, for example, when people are prevented or not able to use social media. And of great importance here, conflict and functional impairment. So basically the negative interferences and impact that a person may experience as a result of using social media excessively to a point where it is an addiction. So according to this scale and the model as a whole, the idea is that the higher the severity on these symptoms, the more likely a person is to be addicted to social media. So when you look at these two networks here, these gender-based networks, we see really strong connections for males, for example. So looking at the left-hand side one. So typically for males, salience and withdrawal symptoms are really well connected. So they tend to be quite prominent, as well as salience and craving intolerance. But for males, the most central symptom is salience. So it basically suggests that excessive preoccupation with social media is the primary feature of addiction for males. When we look at women, it's interesting. So we see strong connection between the symptoms of craving and tolerance with conflict and functional impairment, and between relapse, out of control, and conflict and functional impairment. And the most central symptom here is conflict, functional impairment, which basically suggests that for females, the experience of social media addiction is more marked by disruptions to their negative lives and the other areas of life as well. So what do we take away from this is that women appear to be more affected by the negative impacts to the different aspects of life than male when it comes to experiencing social media addiction. So interfering more with their daily life and well-being, and men, they show higher levels of or centrality in terms of the importance of these symptoms around craving or preoccupation. Cool. Another thing that we probably want to consider as well is the association and how social media addiction relates to other online addictions. That's usually quite useful for us to know, because then we can start drawing parallels and understand the impact or the differential impact of these addictions on mental health and well-being. So we did a study last year where we compared a number of potential online addictions, so online addictions in relation to online gaming, online gambling, shopping, and pornography, and also social media. And we were trying to see where social media addiction sits when we look at the collective of these addictions. So what we found here is that first, all of these online addictions we looked at were actually quite positively associated with one another. What was interesting here is that between all of these addictions, or potential addictions, I should say, at least in the case of, not in the case of gambling and gaming, right? So there was a particularly interesting and high correlation between social media addiction and gaming disorder, which you can think about why this happens. And this basically signals that if there is a positive correlation between all of these addictions, then it means that they share something common, right? There's something about the nature of these addictions that are probably explaining these high associations. Why do we think that social media addiction is particularly strongly associated with gaming disorder? When we think about these issues, we can see that there seems to be I need to be careful with this term, but some sort of convergence between social media platforms and gaming and video games. So basically, the features that you now see on video games and social media platforms are somewhat overlapping in a way. So we have aspects of gamification, right? So social media platforms providing those features that encourage use and leaderboards and streaks, for example. Back in the day, I'm not a huge Facebook user. Actually, I don't use Facebook anymore, but back in the day when I was using Facebook, there were these games, Farmville, and so clearly, like, the lines between gaming and social media platforms are blurred in a way. And I know that there are aspects of gamification happening ever more increasingly in social media platforms. So perhaps that's part of the reason why we see that correlation. We also see that both social media platforms and video games, they really offer that environment where individuals can have those social interactions, entertainment, and in a way, those platforms allow them to alleviate their negative emotions. So some sort of emotional regulation features that these platforms also provide. Now that we know that there is a correlation there between, particularly interesting correlation between social media addiction and gaming disorder, I did a study a few years ago where I was looking exactly at that particular association between social media addiction and gaming disorder, and how these two behavior addictions affect mental health of people. So I did a study with a fairly small sample, so not very impressive, but an interesting sample that gives us an insight on this issue. What I found there at the time was that, again, social media addiction and gaming addiction, they are associated, 0.53 here. So there's the more symptoms of one, the greater the symptoms of the other. And that means that there might be some sort of a feedback loop there as well, where if someone is experiencing high symptoms of social media addiction, that could also lead to higher symptoms, or at least higher risk for gaming, and vice versa as well. Another thing that is important is that when we look at mental health in terms of depression, anxiety, and stress, both of them actually can have this negative impact on how a person feels, and the quality of their mental health status. What I also saw here was that if you look at the effect sizes here, typically, or very nuanced, I would say, there is a slightly higher or stronger effect for gaming disorder in terms of how powerful it is in affecting negatively mental health of participants, but that's not really that large of effect here. So it's quite similar, actually, the way both disorders affect mental health. Another thing that was interesting in this particular study is that I measured time spent using social media platforms, and the weekly time spent here did not predict social media or Facebook addiction in this case. So that clearly is going back to that message that it's not so much about the quantity, but rather the quality and the impact of that usage that matters for us when it comes to explaining addiction. Now, another issue is the one related to assessment. So maybe some of you will be potentially dealing with individuals who might be struggling with their social media usage. So the next question is for you to do this properly and to actually have a measure of the severity of the issue. You will need to use some appropriate measures for that, or tests. There are many of these tests now available, and there has been some interesting developments on parental assessment as well, which is quite good and lacking as well. Although there's always the risk, right? If you're not assessing the person directly and you're asking their parents to fill out, especially thinking about a teenager or children, there's always the risk that the assessment might be somewhat biased, right? Because it's the report. It's actually, you're actually assessing social media addiction based on the impressions and the subjective judgment of the parents. Which I'm not saying it's not useful. Parents definitely would know their kids better than anybody else. That's for sure. But at the same time, sometimes some of the criteria that behavior addictions use are not the best because they rely on some sort of external and subjective assessment, and that can be distorted in some points. So, but nevertheless, I think it is important that some work is done around parental assessment, and I think it is valuable to have that option as well. So, of all of these measures, which ones should you use? Okay, well, I've done the research for you, and what we see is that between all of these measures, there are three that are quite popular and really powerful. So the social media disorder scale that was developed in 2016, the Bergen Facebook addiction scale, and the Bergen social media addiction scale. From all of these three, I prefer, and I use in my research, the Bergen social media addiction scale because it is the shortest with 6 items. So the one by Van okay, I'm not going to pronounce the name. But the social media disorder scale is somewhat longer, so with 27 items. There is a one with 9 items as well. But when it comes to assessing behavior addictions in the clinical setting, a lot of the times, and also in research settings, time is money, and you need those valid, high validity and high reliability measures that include the least amount of items. So for that reason, I really like the Bergen Social Media Addiction Scale. It's been used and validated quite extensively. And according to this review here that looked at nearly 30 studies and 19 assessment tools for social media addiction, that particular measure, so the Bergen Social Media Addiction, has emerged as a really, really good measure to be used. Okay. The reason why I wouldn't be using the Bergen Facebook Addiction Scale anymore is for that very reason, that we should be looking at social media addiction not specific to one platform, but as a behavior, as a phenomenon that can occur on any platform that exists. Okay. So some of you will probably be interested in this. In terms of what kind of a treatment options exists for social media addiction. So this particular study reviews, it's a review of review studies. It's a review inception, I would say. It looked at 12 systematic reviews, 333 primary studies. So a lot of data has been factored in here, and also included 11 meta-analyses, and tried to look at the quality and what sort of a treatment exists for this, right, for social media. The evidence is not particularly exciting, so there is not a great, or these authors have not observed that these studies took the greatest care in the world, so they didn't follow the PRISMA procedures properly. So the PRISMA is a framework that we use for meta-analysis and systematic reviews, and it's really important that this is followed thoroughly, because then this, if not, this can decrease the quality of the findings that you have. So not great there in terms of following those protocols. There's also, the authors mentioned that there was a limited methodological robustness of the evidence. So the great disparity in effect sizes, and also the efficacy of these treatment approaches that exist. And maybe part of the reason for these discrepancies has to do with the different way people define social media addiction and how that then spills over the assessment. Okay. Also, issues around different cutoff points or lack of these. Sometimes researchers are left with very arbitrary decisions as to how they will classify people in terms of whether they're addicted or not. And most importantly, again, this goes back to that point where when we talk about social media addiction, we need to consider the extent of the problems that the behavior causes to the person, rather than be mostly considering these symptoms. The symptoms are important, the points or the scores or the severity are important, but we need to do this assessment holistically. As you can see here, there is a wide range of treatment, so family treatments. CBT is by far the most used, and also pharmacological treatment is used as well. But predominantly, what this study says is that the overwhelming majority of treatment that exists or have been described in the literature are psychological in nature, and, by the way, CBT. Okay. So maybe one thing that is interesting for us to consider here, particularly for those dealing with or trying to understand this issue for children and adolescents, because they are at a greater risk because of the life cycle they are in and the developmental issues they have. So no matter what study you look at, when it comes to behavior addictions, children and adolescents, mostly adolescents, are always at a greater risk because their brain is still developing, and they are at that stage of their lives where they will put themselves at a greater danger compared to an adult who can assess the potential risks of these behaviors. So for these specific groups, I think it's important for us to, if you're doing clinical work, systemic perspectives, so those that work with the family, can be quite powerful. Okay, so that's what the literature suggests, and that's because the way this treatment approach works. So it sees the family as that system that can provide that safety network or support environment that will then help the individual change their behavior. Okay, and that in turn will hopefully increase well-being and help the person improve and recover from social media addiction. Typically, those family-based treatments will focus on the family, as you can imagine, and creating and improving that foundation for that positive functioning within the family and strengthening the relationships within the family, because the theory behind it, or the rationale, is that by strengthening the family and the communication within the family, that will then hopefully improve other issues that the person might be experiencing. Okay, sometimes conflicts and tension exists within the family, that unit, and although it's true that the family unit can be leveraged and used as a way to support and improve the symptoms of these people and eventually treat them, the opposite is also true, right? If the family is dysfunctional and it's not providing that support and safety to these kids and adolescents, then the family can also be the reason why a person might be resorting to addictions, okay, including social media addiction. Some of the techniques that we see in the literature revolve around improving communication within the family. So basically having that open avenue, educating, talking to these young people about the risks of social media use, being part of the world, really. So having that avenue where they can come to you and talk about what they've been doing online, just showing that interest in their virtual world and their social media use is really, really important. It is facilitating that communication, okay? Establishing healthy boundaries, quite important here. So it's really important that families start thinking about what these so-called tech zone freeze or time. So maybe as soon as they enter the room, they should leave their phones and social media enabled devices, let's put it this way, in the hall or the living room. Maybe during meal times, it's important that we just put all the phones on the cage and nobody does anything else other than eating their meal and talking with one another. Having offline time as well is really important, to actually book those offline time and do things together. Actually looking at each other's faces is really, really important to strengthen those relationships. Reinforcing positive behaviors. So not only just focusing on reducing the time, but also reducing the time as a indirect consequence of other things that are happening within the family. So having those family events, going to a walk together, doing things together, a trip, going to the theater, entertaining, outside the virtual world is really, really important. But also celebrating, for example, when the person is able to disconnect from social media in a way that it improves life, okay, in some sort of way. Parental involvement and modeling, again, that goes back to that idea that these young people need to have an open avenue to go back to their parents or significant others to talk about how they feel and what they're doing online. But also, most importantly, and I think a lot of parents forget about these things, is that these kids are looking up to their parents and they're basically doing what they're doing, what they see at home. So if parents are using their phones during the meal times, if they're not having that quality time with their kids and adolescents, this is this kind of reinforcement that will be used or provided to these people, which will then increase dysfunction around social media use. So it's really, really important to lead by example, okay, and be interested in their world as well. So these are some of the very briefly discussed techniques that these family systemic perspectives will try to work on, especially when dealing with adolescents. So just a few notes to conclude. I'm mindful that we are approaching the end of this talk, and I want to see what kind of interesting questions you might have asked me or want to ask me. So just as a few concluding notes here for us to wrap up this talk. So research on social media addiction definitely needs to be improved in terms not only in quality, but also we need to think a bit more carefully about social media addiction and the sort of evidence that we can draw from all these studies. Okay, it's really, really early days, I would say. And we need more and better evidence to make the case for social media addiction to be a true addiction, properly recognized by the American Psychiatric Association, the WHO, as such. So we need to continue the research on social media addiction because it is an important problem. I do believe that some people are affected by it, although I don't believe it's the whole world addicted to social media. That's probably not a very accurate picture, but for those that are struggling with social media addiction, we need to have a proper response and recognition that the problem they're experiencing is something that exists, is recognized. So we need to legitimize the experience for them. Okay, because as it says here, it does impact a wide range of areas. For those that are struggling with social media addiction, that will then spill over health, well-being, the quality of those social interactions, and create problems around productivity to work, productivity to school, for example. And it's really, really important that we tackle and have a response that is appropriate to these people who struggle with social media addiction. Another thing that is really, maybe for the practitioner, it's not the most important thing to have those theories, but the theories, they inform the research, they inform the assessment, and they inform the way we see those problems happening and the kind of what consequences can occur as a result of these problems. So we don't have many carefully crafted theories in social media addiction. That's not a problem specific to social media addiction, I must say. When we look at other addictions that are a lot more established, like gaming, for example, we still see this problem of we haven't thought this through yet in terms of how can we understand the actual predictive factors, the risk factors, the negative consequences of it at the psychological, social, and biological level, and how can we see the whole picture. So we lack those theories doing this holistic assessment of the extent of the problems caused by social media addiction. And obviously, because we're still at early days of research in social media addiction, treatment also is not as highly developed as you would expect. But there is some promising results around CBT techniques, CBT therapies for social media addiction, and also other addictions, and particularly of interest to adolescents and children. Family systemic perspectives are quite good. So thank you so much for your time. I'm happy to take some questions for now. So here's the slider. Okay, so I'm just on the slider. I'm just going to go over the questions now. I've got 5 questions. First one was, what kind of programs exist in the UK to treat social media addiction? I'm not aware of any program at least from within the public health system. The UK has shown concern with behavioral addictions. There is a treatment options within the NHS for the National Healthcare System. So there are treatment options for gaming and gambling, but I'm not aware. I don't believe there is for social media addiction, and mostly private providers would be dealing with that, I believe. Yeah. The other question is, could social media use patterns contribute to the development of conditions like digital dementia or other memory-related impairments? I think that's a really good question, so thanks for that. I think there is some studies looking at attentional problems, which again are quite strongly associated with memory-related issues as well. And what we see is that there's this whole attention economy behind social media platforms, meaning they're trying to grab a person's attention as much as they can, as best as they can, because that is affecting their revenue, their bottom lines, right? So I wouldn't be surprised if there is a relationship there between social media addiction and memory-related impairments, because we see that typically it affects short-term memory, working memory, and also attentional problems. Okay, I hope I've provided some good insights to your question. Okay, so the next question was, what do you see as the next frontier of research regarding social media addiction? Well, that's a great question, and I think we could have another talk just to discuss it. But what I think it's really, really important moving forwards, and something that needs to be done, is in relation to bringing the worlds of clinical practice with the world of research. And it really is important that we start to refine the understanding of social media addiction by asking those potentially affected individuals, how social media addiction looks like. Once we do that, once we have a solid understanding of what is social media addiction to these potentially addicted individuals that have been clinically assessed, then we can put to test the existing psychometric tests, which people use in research and clinical practice, and we can try to understand whether they work well or not. And if they don't work well, which might be a good suspicion, then we'll have certainly good ways for, or good information to move those forwards and refine them according to the experience of these people. So for me, the next frontier will be mostly trying to bring together the world of clinical practice and the world of research, because there is a big bridge there. So let me see the other question. The ones with the most likes. Do you think social media addiction will become more prevalent in the future, or will societal awareness and regulation mitigate its impact? That's a great question. We need to consider a few things. We know that from other fields that within addiction, I'm talking about, that high convenience, meaning when you can use the internet and social media anywhere, anytime. So convenience, accessibility, and affordability, meaning how much does it cost? So when the cost is low or non-existent, when accessibility is high, these are facilitating factors for addiction. So they tend to fuel addiction rates. Personally, I do not think social media addiction will become more prevalent, but that could change, right? It's hard to predict because there might be other social media platforms that are developed that basically leverage or should I say hijack our reward system in the brain and are potentially more addictive. I would say it could be that it can get more prevalent, but typically, prevalence rates are quite stable over the years. And for social media addiction, if you're looking at those really, really good studies, you wouldn't necessarily see higher prevalence rates than 5%. Okay, so that is a safe figure to assume over the years. The other question with the most votes, so I don't know I think I still have time, right? Yeah, cool. Do you think that is possible to define objective criteria, example, person's vital signs, eye movement, etc., for social media addiction, and if so, how? That's a great question. I guess my colleagues doing psychophysiological research would be better positioned to do that, to answer this question. But I think you could definitely, I think the problem here is the same as, with neuropsychology, right? So there's a lot of money and research time that is spent on understanding the brain areas that are activated during specific scenarios when a person is exposed to a stimuli that elicits an addiction response. When they may see an image, for example, let's say they're recovering alcoholics. So researchers will show pictures of pubs, drinks, and that will then activate a specific area in the brain. We can probably do the same here, but there will never be, it will be really difficult, I should say, to establish those causal links between the specific psychophysiological measures and addiction. Ultimately, it depends on, it has to be a holistic assessment, right? So because it's a psychosocial experience, we always need to include psychological considerations, so personality, individual differences, but also social considerations. So I don't think we'll be able to fully and objectively capture social media addiction just using our physiological measures. I think we can have a bit of an understanding, but whether that is capturing entirely addiction or not, I'm not too sure. The next question was, why are female more drawn to TikTok and Snapchat, and why male to Twitter? What is about those platforms that attracts each gender respectively? That's a great question. I don't think we have studies looking specifically at that. So what I'm going to say now is based on my educated guess. I think males, okay, let's go back to the evolutionary factors. Twitter, especially more recently, has become quite of a toxic place, whether you agree or disagree. I know there's a lot of a political contention there. And regardless of those political issues, Twitter has become a very adversarial platform, and it has always been a platform where you don't have a lot of characters to use, right? 140 or 70, and that typically tends to inflame conversations because you don't have that possibility of expanding on those things. So it's quite adversarial. And then if you go back to testosterone, so more emails, so perhaps that could be part of the reason. TikTok and Snapchat, more imagery-based platforms, which I think could appeal more to females. Not sure how I can explain that evolutionarily, but I think these platforms appeal more to females because of the way they were designed, meaning Snapchat and TikToks. So, for example, if you look at imagery-based platforms like Pinterest, almost no males use Pinterest. Of course, there are men that use it, but those platforms that appeal to aesthetic, visual aesthetics, and imagery content typically are more appealing to females. So there's only 2 more questions here. I think I have some time for them, but I'm going to speed through then. I'm going to close the Q&A, by the way, but I'm going to go over these 2 questions. So can you please explain more about the difference in the prevalence of social media addiction between individualistic and collectivistic cultures? Great question. So if you think about these 2 specific cultures, so collectivistic cultures are leaning more towards the social relationship. So they put more focus and emphasis on, or importance really, to the social relationships. So for them, it's, if social media platforms facilitate that social bonding and social connections, you would expect higher levels of usage of social media there, and therefore greater prevalence rates compared to individualistic cultures where that social relevance is not as important. It is important, but not as much as collective culture. Just to delete, so last question, just to delete social media or just stop using it, it's not enough, especially with people with psychiatric diagnosis. What else do you recommend to do? That's a great point, actually. One of the goals of treatment is not complete abstinence. I would say, because social media addiction is positive and beneficial for most people, what is more interesting here is to, through treatment, understand how the client can be re-educated, let's put it this way, or can be retrained to use social media to the best of their interests. Meaning, perhaps the goal is not to complete altogether, but regulate when and how best to use those platforms. Because if all the other things that matter, like doing the homework, for example, showing up to work and maintaining in-person relationships, when those things are done, then maybe the person can free up some time to using social media. But the opposite is that we're trying to prevent here that social media overtakes everything and the person is not able to function and do everything else they need. So it's more a matter of not achieving abstinence or complete stopping, but rather regulating, learning how to regulate. And I think that's where treatments needs to improve as well. All right, that's all questions. Thank you very much for your time. And yeah, I think I'm going to be turned off now.